All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you happen to be watching us from. Thank you for joining us today for App Builder Live. We have, I think, a pretty fantastic show. It's something that a number of folks have been asking for, which is a deep dive into API mesh. And we have just the person to deliver this session. So thank you so much for joining us. If you happen to be watching the recording, what have you, hopefully this is going to be something that's super valuable for building, troubleshooting, and leveraging the API mesh with Adobe Commerce. So before we jump into that, I hope everybody's having a great summer. It has been a long time since I've had an App Builder Live session. We are going to start doing these more regularly. We've got another session coming up in about, I don't know, probably within the month of the Adobe Commerce Starter Kit. So we'll talk about how to get started with the Starter Kit and dive into what that's all about. And then we have another session on App Builder functionality. So essentially focusing on the App Builder Turns 10.0 episode that we did a couple of months ago, or now it's probably 4 months ago. And some of the functionality that we previewed there is now live. So we're going to go through and show how that works and the benefits you get there. And then last thing I want to mention is I am doing a new show. So if you are interested in web development, it is all focused on web development for web developers. It is the first episode, Navigating Web Performance, and I'll get the link into the chat for that. So, but without further ado, let me introduce Revanth. And hey, man, how you doing?
Hey, Ron. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. So how are things in Austin? Everything good there?
All good. All good. It's about to rain. It looks beautiful.
Excellent. All right. So you were going to cover API mesh. We're going to do a deep dive, and you're going to cover off. You're going to answer everyone's questions, essentially. Even if they're not answering or asking any questions, their questions will be answered, hopefully, with this session. Yeah.
Perfect. I hope so.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
That's the goal. Okay. Well, I am going to hand it over to you, and we'll just jump right in. Okay.
Thank you so much, Ron.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the deep dive session for API mesh with App Builder. Before we learn anything new, I believe it's good to ask 3 questions. First one is a what, then why, and then how. So let's start with that. Let's see what is API mesh and try to understand like what's the purpose of it in a normal tech world. So imagine there's a tool that can combine multiple sources, data sources. It could be a REST endpoint, it could be a GraphQL endpoint, OpenAPI, Swagger, anything. Imagine there's a tool that can combine all of them into a single GraphQL endpoint. Imagine how simplified your life would be as a front-end developer when now you don't need to handle so many of your sources, and imagine all of those sources if they can be used against a single endpoint. And this is going to make your development much smoother, deployments much faster, and enhance the application performance, mainly because it's dependent on GraphQL. And that's exactly what API mesh is. So it is an extensible reverse GraphQL proxy. That's a lot, right? So let's break it up. So it's a reverse proxy at the heart, meaning it sits right in front of all your backend sources. And just like any reverse proxy, it offers all the benefits that you get with it, mainly better security, added benefits of threat modeling, or you can have throttling, DDoS protection, all of it. And then it's a GraphQL proxy, meaning it's not just relying all your messages, all your requests from your front end to the back end, but it is also making some thoughtful decisions in the GraphQL world. So let's say you have all these sources that you want to talk to. Instead of making multiple calls to these sources, you can make just one single GraphQL call. And API Mesh is going to make sure it breaks things up and navigate each one of them to the individual sources they belong to. And it's extensible, meaning it's not just being a dumb proxy. You can actually add business logic there. You can add business logic, like you can pull in multiple sources, do something with that data before you return it back. And all of these you can achieve with low or no code. And that's what API measures. So imagine, let's say you have an example where you run an e-commerce store, and it's right around a holiday season, and you want to run a promotion. You want to show some banners on your front end, and you want to apply some discounts to your products. Imagine if you want to do this in a traditional world, you would do it in the backend. First of all, you have to set up your notifications or announcements API. It could be a marketing backend or anything, but you have to set it up through Commerce or whatever user backend, and then forward it from there to your front end and have your front end render them. But with API Mesh, it's much easier because you don't need to touch Commerce anymore. You don't need to touch your backend. You just need to do these things on the fly in the middleware. And that's where API Mesh is. That's why it is called extensible. And at the same time, if you want to add any discounts or sale or change anything with respect to your business logic, you can do it at the mesh level. I specifically brought this example up mainly because it's exactly what we'll be doing today towards the demo. Okay. So why? We actually answered what, like what API Mesh is. Now let's look at why. Like, what does it give us? Like I was saying, since it's a reverse proxy, you are adding a lot more security for your backends in the middleware. And instead of touching all your backends and going and adding all sorts of load balancing or DDoS protection or throttling or any of it, you can literally do that at the middle layer and offload all of it for that. And now, since API Mesh is handling all your requests and it's handling all these checks and balances, your CPU, RAM, and everything, all your resources for your backends are spared. They are doing a lot less work, which means more stability and more robustness. And and also the fact that it's a much better tool and makes life much easier for developers and also your front ends, because previously when you wanted to do something, any change on your backend, you had to do a deployment there, wait for that deployment, again deploy your front end and on all these things. But now with API Mesh, it's much easier, and the deployments on Mesh take not more than any few minutes, sometimes a minute or two. So with all these things in mind, let's actually look at what API Mesh can serve for us and what does it actually look like. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the documentation because that's going to be your best resource when you actually want to use API Mesh for yourself. Mesh is not an individual product; it's a licensed product along with developer. Adobe Developer App Builder. So if you get license for App Builder, you get license for API Mesh straight away. So let's imagine you already have it. Let's see what does it take to create a mesh, and also what does a mesh look like. So mesh, like I was saying, you can achieve all these things with low or no code, and everything is done through a single file called mesh config. Everything else you provide along with your mesh config is just substitute data for it, but the main crux of it is your mesh JSON. And with your mesh handlers. So these are the main things in your mesh. You can create sources on your mesh. Right now, let's look at a quick example where you only have a single source. At this point, API Mesh is just acting as a reverse proxy. It's hiding a commerce endpoint. You can give your endpoint here, and you can name your source whatever you want. It's easier for organizational purposes. You can organize all your data and your sources and all. But the main thing is your endpoint or the source. So in this case, we are looking at, let me increase the size a bit. We're looking at an open API source. So your mesh right now is acting as a reverse proxy for the open API source. Similarly, there are a lot of the sources that you can add. You can bring in a GraphQL source straight away. You can bring in JSON schemas. JSON schema is the name given to REST endpoints. So you can, as you can see here, I can define a source called cards, for example, and give any, if you have any shadow card, or if you have any card sources that are doing anything specific, anything special on top of what Commerce does, you can maybe define it as a source here. And if it was a REST endpoint, instead of using OpenAPI or GraphQL, you would use JSON schema, and you would just give your base URL and then define operations on top of it. If you are uh, aware of how GraphQL works, you have to define operations like fields, for example. Similarly, what we're doing here is defining these operations on the source itself. And that is it. Once you do this, your source is going to be ready, your mesh is going to be ready, it's going to be deployed in a few minutes, and then you can start using it as if you were using the source directly. And all these things are interchangeable. You can have a mesh with two open API sources, one GraphQL, a tons of JSON schemas, and all. You can have how many ever you can, and and that's where the mesh comes in. It's an orchestration tool at the heart of it. You can orchestrate all your backends in the middle layer. There is also the SOAP handler, which is experimental at this point. But if you have any sources that run on SOAP protocol, you can continue to use them here. But that's the crux. You got to start with handlers. You have to provide at least one handler, and that's your mesh. And at the same time, you can actually transform your data. You can change, if let's say you have two sources that are conflicting, they have few fields that are conflicting, you can maybe use a filter schema to remove one of those fields from one of the sources and use the field from the other source. Let's say you have commerce, which has countries, and then you also have a different source, maybe or currency, for example, and then you have like a discounting source which also provides currency. Both fields are conflicting right now. Maybe you can skip one of them. So for conflict management, you can use filter schema. So it's going to filter out few things. For example, here what we have is AEM and PWA Studio, these two sources. And let's say I don't want uh, the category and customer orders to be used. I'm just going to use the filter schema to filter those things out. Similarly, you can use a prefix schema. So if you want to handle conflicts but not remove them, you can just add a prefix saying, if I have a commerce source, every field or every operation that's coming from it should have a prefix called commerce underscore. And similarly, you have a lot others. It's very hard to go into each one of them, because each one of them defines something, they stand for something. But you can transform your data. Similarly, you have other features, advanced features, like you can set up course headers. Like if you want to use your mesh on a front end, obviously you need to set up course. And if you have caching, the best part of APM mesh is you can add caching at the middle layer, meaning all your backends, they don't need to add caching at them. You can maybe bring in your own CDN, like for example, Fastly. We have documentation around like how you can do this through Fastly, but you're not limited to Fastly. You can bring in your own CDN and put the CDN in front of mesh. That way, you're also adding caching layer to it. So every time you make a request, if your GraphQL request is trying to hit 3 or 4 sources, instead of going to each of those sources and increasing the time and all, you can maybe put a CDN in front. So now the CDN is going to cache your request for the first time. Next time onwards, it's going to return it. And since you own the CDN, you have full control over how you want to define it or how you want to invalidate the data there. Uh, and then there are other things. We have launched other features, for example, hooks. It's one of the most famous out of process extensibility feature. Like if you want to do something right before an operation is performed, like maybe you wanted to add authentication. Maybe your sources already gave you authentication, but you want to do something else. You want to talk to a third party source, verify if this query is valid or not, verify if this query is hitting the right sources or not. All those things you can create a hook on the mesh itself. And here we have a before all hook, which means whatever you provide in here, it could be a serverless function, it could be a local file. Whatever you provide here, it's going to be run first ahead of your operation. And if this responds true or false, depending on that, if it throws an error, obviously the query is returned with the error that the hook threw. If not, it's going to continue. The operation is going to continue. So you are adding all these lifecycle hooks around your operations. And adding more logic to your backend sources. Similarly, there is secrets management, where if you have any secrets, any tokens or API keys or anything you don't want your front ends to know, anything you don't want to put in your front end, maybe you can put it in the middleware and use it from there. And since this is an integrated approach, we don't own the secrets. You own the secrets. You provide the secrets. We completely encrypt them end to end, and we only use it on the mesh. And you can always go through the documentation around understanding how to set up these secrets on a mesh and how to start using them inside it. But for the sake of the demo, let's look at a very simple example to start off with, and then eventually we'll get into the complex part. Okay, so to get started, first of all, we need to set up the CLI, the AIO CLI, because that's what we'll be using to interact with the mesh, to create, update, or query a mesh. It's going to give the endpoints which you can use to query. Along with it, we also have the dev console approach, where you can look at your meshes. You can't manipulate them on the dev console at the moment, but then you can look at your meshes. You can look at all the information that you would need usually to query your mesh. So to get started, let's actually let me show you like how the dev console is laid out and how the organization and everything, the organizational structure is, because that's exactly what we'll be using for the CLI. All right, this is what the dev console is going to look like. Imagine, let's say you already have access to dev console and you already have access to app builder. You should be able to create a new project. In favor of time, I already created a project here, API mesh deep dive session. And as you can see, once I open this up, I have multiple workspaces in it. And this is just a logical separation of where you want to put your mesh. And if I put something in dev, it's not going to interact with what I have in production. Not necessarily this is dev or this is production. I just happen to name them that way. So it's easier for us to see how maybe a team can propagate their meshes. Maybe they can have a mesh in dev where they're testing and then slowly propagate it to QA stage and production. This is usually what developers do. But then you can absolutely name them anything you want. For example, I have a dev instance here. In favor of time, I also created a mesh, but we'll see how to get to that. I'll just quickly show you how the UI is going to look like. Once you create a mesh on a dev workspace or any workspace, you will see a card called API mesh. Let's open it up. You get all the important details that you would need to start using this mesh. So when it comes to mesh or API mesh, you have two actors. One is a mesh user, the other is a mesh owner. So the mesh owner is the person or the team who owns that mesh, who creates and manipulates that mesh. And the mesh users are typically the front ends that use it. So the mesh users are only aware of the query URL. What you see here, you can copy and start querying it. You can use your front end, you can use any GraphQL playground, a graphical Altair or Postman or anything. Today, we'll use a combination of graphical Altair and Postman, mix of all of them. And then what you see here, this UI is not available to mesh users. This is only for mesh owners. You got to be a developer or an admin to have access to this. And this is all through Okta and everything. So this is exactly how, once you create your mesh, it's going to look like. Now that we have seen this, let's actually see how you can get started with the mesh. Let me go to terminal. Again, in the interest of time, I've set up the CLI. And the CLI, what you need is AIO and then the API mesh plugin on top of it. That is all. And the documentation around getting started will help you through the whole process. You can set up the CLI and then you can set up your environment. This is the plugin I was talking about. And the very first thing you would do is init a workspace on your local. So you need to first of all set up your file structure where all your meshes and everything are going to reside. So for that, I'm going to do AIO API mesh init, and I have to give a name to it. So let's call it Adobe API mesh deep dive. It's a mouthful, but let's see. Okay, first of all, it's going to ask me, do you want to create in the right workspace or not? Yes. And then do you want to initiate Git? This is a very important question. Initiating Git is going to help you with organizing your code in any Git repo, not necessarily GitHub. and it's easier to communicate with your team. And since it's a version control, you can also set up your version control in such a way that a certain branch is connected to a certain workspace. So we have earlier seen that we have multiple workspaces, and you can create how many workspaces you want on a particular project. And you can maybe connect the dev workspace to the dev branch and production to the main branch, and etc. So it's much easier, and it's our suggestion as well to use Git and mostly GitHub. And I'll get to that and why I was suggesting GitHub, and we'll eventually see it. So let's say we have Git. I say, yes, I want to set up Git. And now it's going to ask me, what's your package manager? I usually select Yarn. It's much faster. But if you're comfortable with NPM, consider doing it. And then it's going to ask me, this directory is not empty. Obviously, I have other things going on in this directory. So I'm going to create a subdirectory with the name. That's it. These are the 3-4 questions it's going to ask you. And now it's going to set up my local instance. And it usually takes a minute, but let me meanwhile. I think I have it open here. Yes, I have a sample open. Again, in the interest of time, I set it up. This is once it sets up, once the init is done, the command. This is how your workspace is going to look like. Let me increase the size a little bit. This is how it's going to look like. You're going to get all the necessary files needed for you to start local development, start publishing your meshes, and using GitHub, and I'll get to that, and then using the CI/CD for automatically publishing your meshes without you manually doing them every single time. So let's open the mesh JSON. This is a very simple mesh JSON right now. I have just mesh config and just one source, and it's the commerce source. And the endpoint is just the open endpoint that we use in Venue right now today. And on top of it, you can see that I have provided an extra config called response config, and it's called include HTTP details. What this does is if you have multiple sources, it's going to give you more insights into how your sources are actually doing. Right now, this might not help you much, but eventually when we start adding more sources and more customizations on top of them, this is going to help us a lot. And you don't necessarily need this in production. And if you see the performance is going down or your network bandwidth is going up, consider switching it off. But it's usually pretty small. Okay. Okay, all right. So we are done at this point. So our workspace is already created with the local folder structure. So let's actually open it up. I'm going to do, I use VS Code, but again, you can use any IDE of your choice. I again use VS Code mainly because we already provide all the VS Code related configs along with the init command. So let's actually open it up. Code, and what did we name it? We named it Adobe API Mesh. Okay. All right. Let's close this. Let's increase the size a bit. All right. So this is exactly how earlier I was showing how my folder structure is going to look like. And since we said yes to Git, automatically VS Code picked up all these things and all. We'll get to that soon. But then let's look at the mesh. Similarly, this is the exact same mesh what we had before, but the only difference is we have, instead of using the endpoint directly, we actually provided a variable. We are saying the endpoint for this commerce API is actually going to come from environment, and the variable name is commerce endpoint. So if again, every folder structure gives you an env by default. So if I open the env, you have this field and all. It's empty right now, but you can just quickly pick up this name, this URL, put this here, and then that's it. You don't need to do anything. So your mesh is usable straight up. So let's actually try and see how this mesh looks like once it's running. So we have a command for that, API mesh run, and you got to give the file that you want to run, the config that you want to run. So let's do this. You can see it's immediately building. On the right, you can see a few folders being created. These are actually all the artifacts and all the schemas that it's creating internally. So before I query, it spit out a URL where I can query my mesh. But before querying, let's actually see how does an artifact look like. So here is an artifact, sample artifact. We have a schema, and this schema is very important. This schema right now is actually coming from just one source. We only have one source, right? We just provided a commerce endpoint default. But if you, let's say you had multiple sources, if you added like 4 or 5 sources, this schema is going to be quite important for you because it's going to be the unified schema for that whole mesh. Along with it, if you want to drill down into each one of those individual schemas, you do have the sources folder. And had I had like more sources here, I would have seen a lot more here. Again, this schema is the same right now, but if you had multiple sources, this will be the sub schema. This is going to be the superset of it. All right. You don't need to know any of these to start using your mesh. You just need to know that once you run the run command, you get an endpoint here. I can copy this. Again, like I was suggesting, you can use any graphical playground of your choice. I have Altair here. It's a Chrome extension. So just paste your endpoint. And this is a very simple sample query. And again, for the sake of it, I'll probably get store name as well. And once I make, let me increase the size a little bit. All right. When I make this request, right now this is actually going to my local instance of the mesh, but internally that mesh is actually forwarding this to Venia. That's what we used. And as you start adding more and more of these sources, you can start querying them. Depending on the playground that you're using, you get access to the docs, so it's much easier to use them. You can click on this, and I believe you can start adding the docs in certain of your playgrounds. So you can directly right click, and then add it to your existing query. All right, now we have seen how a mesh could be, like how the local dev is going to look like. So let's actually push this up, and let's see how easy is it to create this mesh and deploy it. So I'm going to stop the server. I'm going to clear it. And now I'm going to use API mesh create. That's the create command. And I'm going to give mesh.json. And that's the file. Again, if you can see, even though I had some placeholders, I really don't need to give them here. The create command can automatically pick up all these references, and it's going to build all of them into a single artifact and push it up. So once I do this, it's going to ask me, where do you want to create? Like I was showing here, if I go back to Dev Console, we were on the Commerce Extensibility Lab. That's my organization. And my project is API Mesh Deep Dive Session, and my workspace is Dev. I already happen to have a mesh there for showing you. So I can probably use maybe a stage. And a good cue would be on the UI. If you see API Mesh already on your workspace card, which means there is already a mesh on it. So consider using maybe a stage. And or you can always create new workspaces as well. So I'm probably going to use the stage. I'm going to select Commerce Extensibility. This is a search. Right now, mine happen to be right at the top, but if you have more, you can always search them. So I'm going to select this, and it's going to ask me, do you want to save this information for future operations? So it's easier. You don't have so many button clicks next time if you want to update or do any manipulation with your mesh. Yes. And then I'm going to select stage. Yes. The last question, it's going to ask you, do you want to create it? Because this is a side effect operation, meaning you can create similar to how update and delete. It's going to ask you before it continues. So let's create it. Right now, what it's doing is it's going to create the mesh. Along with it, it's going to create an API key, and it's going to subscribe that API key to the API mesh service. And finally, it gave me this endpoint. I said it usually takes a minute or two. Sometimes it's even faster. Mostly, it must be already done at this point. So let's actually go to Altair. I'm going to use the same query and all. I'm just going to switch the URL. I don't have the local URL anymore. So I'm just going to put the endpoint we just saw. That's it. So now I'm actually getting it from the deployed instance. So literally within less than a minute, we were able to deploy our mesh. You can see this is literally working. That's much faster. So your deployments are faster and easier. And right now, you're done basically creating your mesh. But what more can you do with this? Let's say you lost your endpoint. There is a command for you to get all the details necessary to start using your mesh again. So API mesh describe. it describes the whole mesh for you. Again, as you can see, it didn't ask me all the details again because I said, please store this information for the future operations. So now it gave me all the information I would need. And it gave me the endpoint as well. You can start using this. You can use the get command to get the whole config. And you can also download the config. Not that you need to use this, but you can also do it from the UI. You can go into DevCon. Let's actually go to stage because we recently created there. Let's go to stage and API mesh. And this is where it is. You can download the mesh schema right from there. And you can look at, right now I only have sources. So it's going to show you sources. I don't have any transforms or any files on the mesh. So there's nothing. But let's actually see and do a lot more with the mesh, not just having it as a reverse proxy. So what I'm going to do now is push up this mesh. So right now, this is my local mesh folder structure, right? I never committed anything. Everything is still in my local. I can set up a GitHub endpoint and start pushing them here. But again, in the interest of time, I already have created this deep dive session similar to what you see here. I just initiated the project, and I already pushed this to GitHub. So let's actually see how this looks on GitHub and what more can we do with that. So I have this here. This is my deep dive session. And once you push it up to GitHub, let me increase the size, push it up to GitHub, this is how it's going to look like. I happen to create multiple branches there. Like I was saying, maybe my base branch is connected to a dev workspace and main is connected to production. You can set it up however you want. We don't suggest how to do it, or we don't add any rules around it. Okay, once I push up my code base to GitHub, this is how it's going to look like. But the main part is the dev container. Previously, we looked at the mesh JSON, package JSON, and all of those things, env. But we also had other folders like dev containers and GitHub workflows. So what are these? What are they going to do for me? So GitHub right now has launched a feature called Code Spaces. I believe it's been around for a while, and I hope it's free. There are some it's a freemium service, so you have free tier that you can use. So right now, you can click on code. You can create how many ever code spaces you want, and you can share these with your team. So if you have like a truly global team working from home, all of you can have like a code space and share code spaces, and it's like having VS Code online. That's the only difference. Anyways, I'm not here to advertise code spaces, but let's actually see how we can use code spaces if you actually want to. Since I was suggesting the init command already gives you all the dev container and everything related to it, all you got to do is come here and click plus to create a container. Usually creating a container takes a while, around 4 to 5 minutes, because it needs to download all the necessary images and set it up. Again, in the interest of time, I've set it up for us. Wow, this is super small. Let me increase the size. Yeah. Restart. All right. Maybe due to inactivity, just shut it down, but let's switch it on. Right now, as you can see, this structure looks exactly like how VS Code is. So you can, whatever you were doing in VS Code locally, you can do it here. And whatever the VS Code config that we have provided there will be applicable here. So right now we have the same mesh, the same exact mesh, commerce and all. And let's say I want to add announcements to it. I have a simple mesh right now, but I want to use maybe some announcement service or some marketing backend along with this and start adding announcements into my store config. So we have these Adobe Commerce samples repo. It's a public repo that anyone can use. There is this API mesh section. We have added few examples already here, few very useful examples with all the explanation needed or necessary for it. We continue to and we vouch to add more in the future. And here, for the sake of announcements, let's actually go to the custom field example. And we did this. So this is how the custom field is going to look like. And my mesh config is again pretty simple. You already saw this. It's a commerce endpoint. Along with this, all I'm going to do is add some announcements, create another source. And this time, my announcement source is a dummy source. It's like a Lambda kind of thing. It's just Cloudflare backend, dummy backend, and all it does is just return some sample data for us to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this config. You can do this as well. Um, this is a public repo, so you can copy this whenever you init your source, your folder. Go ahead, use anything from here. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go to my mesh, and in the sources array, I'm going to create a new source. I forgot this extra bracket. Okay, that's it. So I added a new source, and now I have to give the value to it, right? Like right now it's a variable. So let's actually go back. We have a sample env along with it. I'm going to go to sample env. I'm going to pick up the sample announcements endpoint that we have created, the dummy endpoint. I'm going to put it here. So let's actually see what does this mean. So this is the definition for a new source. I'm going to call it announcements, and it's a JSON schema, meaning this is a REST endpoint. So I'm going to use the JSON schema handler instead of the GraphQL handler, and I'm going to give a base URL saying this is the base URL. Later, I'm going to define operations on it because in GraphQL, everything needs to be defined ahead of time. It should be part of your schema. You should define it. So I'm going to define a field called announcements on this source, and it's a get. I'm just saying it's a get call. You need to make it, and it's directly available on this path. If let's say you had a different path, maybe I could give like slash announcements or something like that. But right now, my announcements are directly available on this. Again, operations is an array, which means you can add how many ever you want. And let's go back and custom field along with along with the source. We, like I was saying, we need to create a new type on it. So I'm going to copy quickly this. I'm going to add it. Oops. I'm going to add it here after the sources array. Okay. So what did we do here? We are adding new type definitions to our schema because like I was saying, you want to use, I want to, let's say, add these announcements, which is the third party service, into Commerce, into the store config that we earlier saw. So I need to extend the store config type to add a new field inside of it called announcements, and I'm just defining it as a string. That is it. And now we defined this announcement field on the store config. Similarly, we have to give it a definition. Like we have to implement it, and that's what is coming from the resolvers.js file. So let's create a file called resolvers.js, and again, the definition can come from here. We have a file. For the sake of the demo, let's just copy it, paste them here, and just format it. And there are comments around like what each one of those lines are doing, but I'll quickly go over. So resolvers, like I was saying, we created a field on store config called announcement, so we are now defining it, implementing it. So store config is the main key, and then in the sub key we have announcements. Along with it, we are giving a resolver function, and all this resolver is doing is directly going to the announcements API that we earlier defined on the mesh, the announcements API. It's going there, it's calling the query, and it's a query called announcements. Where did we get this? We actually got this from the field that we defined. So this is where the definition we gave here is going to be useful in the implementation. And all I'm doing is going there and getting an announcement from it. And I'm just going to return it. It's a very simple example, but it's a powerful example showing you how you can do this without touching your backend. So let's actually see. Like I was suggesting, this is VS Code just online. I can do yarn start, and I can give my mesh.json. That's it. Once I do this, it's going to start building my mesh automatically, just like how you saw earlier on your local. And it's going to open up the browser for us. All right. And if you ever run into a case where your code space is taking a lot longer, or it's not able to cope with the resources that you have, you can always create a new code space with more configurations. And you can give like how many cores or how much RAM do you want. For the sake of it, right now, Mesh is an extremely light service, which means even a 2-core and a very base configuration is enough. It's hard here. I'm using a single monitor. So let's actually open it up as a different browser. And I'm going to go to the GraphQL endpoint. So once I do this, every mesh is also going to give you a playground. You can switch it off if you want, but it gives you the playground. So it's easier for you to try out your mesh and practice your meshes. So here, let me increase the size. So here we have the store config, we have a store code. All these are actually coming from Commerce. But we just defined an announcement field, right? So let's do this. Let's say if I just do store code, I'm just getting the store code. And like I was saying, in the HTTP details, you can get more details about the source. You can say this was the query we did, and then what was the URL, and how long did it take. We get that here, the response time. And similarly, now if I want announcements, we created this field. So I'm going to query announcements this time. So we got an announcement back. We said get 40% off on all products, etc., etc. Like I was saying, this is a dummy announcement, but you can extend this. You can put your marketing endpoint here and get all the marketing data and maybe plug it into Commerce or anything. And again, as you can see here, we have two sources this time, HTTP details. Like we have two of them, mainly because even though it looks like we are hitting Commerce, we are internally hitting the announcements API. So that's why you see HTTP details for both of them. You have Commerce, which took 176 milliseconds, and then we have announcements, which took 49 milliseconds. So it gives all those extra details for you. You can switch this off in production if you want to. All right, so now my mesh is ready. I have created a new mesh on top of the existing mesh. I added more features called announcements. I added custom resolvers and everything. What if I want to actually publish this mesh? We have this extra file here called GitHub, and then there is a workflows and deploy.yaml. Again, this gets you actually get this with the init command itself. And all this does is automate everything related to updates for your mesh. You don't need to do anything. You just need to commit your data, commit your files. So right now I created two files, right? I updated my mesh JSON to have the announcements API and define this new field. And then in the resolvers, I actually gave definition for that field. So let's actually commit these two. I'll say added announcements support in store config. That's it. I'm going to commit my changes. I'm going to push it. You can see my Git is already done. And if I go back, if I go to deep dive session, that's the repo. If I go to actions, you can see there's a new action going on. And it has the name as the commit message that we have. Added announcement, support, etc. Again, this is going to take few minutes, because it has to set up the whole container where it downloads Ubuntu and all. It sets up AI or CLI, and it's going to run the update for you automatically. But let me go to actions and let me show you a different example, something I tried 2 hours ago. So if I go here, we have one job completed. If I open this, you can see it set up the job and everything. It did OAuth automatically. You have to set up all those things, and then it set up the CLI, selected the org, project workspace, everything, and then it did the update. Let me open this up. It says AIO API mesh run update, and then it gave the mesh JSON and all, and it did the update immediately. And all of this happened automatically. We didn't touch the terminal ever. So I'll let this continue for now, but we have another example. In the interest of time, again, I created another example, but this time it's even more complex. So we added announcements as part of this example. So what more can we do on top of it? So let's say I have this discounting API, and while running these announcements on the front end as a banner, I also want to apply some discounts on top of my existing products. So let's say I'm getting my products from catalog service or the commerce service, and I'm getting them some discounts as a third-party service. Maybe it's some internal service of our own, and you can use all of them together. So let me show you the quick example. close this. Let me close this. So this is the pretty much same as what you have before. We had the commerce endpoint, we had the announcements endpoint. On top of it, I created another source called discounts API. And again, it's a JSON schema. You give the base URL. This is a dummy guy. All it does is it's going to return some dummy discounts for all the products you query. So you can see I'm defining all the discounts and all. And all I'm doing is, along with the resolvers what we had before, the announcements resolvers, I'm adding a new resolver called cart and batching resolvers. So let's actually see them quickly. We have a batching resolver, and what this does is it's going to take the special price field on top of the configurable product, and it's giving definition to it. And what we have implemented here is take the maximum price of your product and apply the discount you got from your source. All these are available on the code samples. You can go to code samples, API mesh, and find all of them, chain mutations and custom field, etc., etc. You can find all of them there. We are cutting close to time. So what I'm going to do is I'll show you this in action. So I have, so all of these are port forwarded. The advantage there, we have set up port forwarding, which means you can copy this. Where is this? Copy local address. GraphQL. Let me close this. So this is the query that we had. And I have the announcements. I'm querying announcements. I'm also querying products right now. And as you can see, I have a special price field. This is no different. It's actually an existing field. But this time what we did is, for an existing field, we gave a definition to it. So all I'm going to do is click this, just play. And you can see that I have this value, which is coming from commerce. But the special price is actually a combination of commerce and the discounting API. For the sake of transparency, let's actually go to Venia, which is the backend commerce source for this example. Oh, not here. Let's go to Alter, click new. If I go to Venia, and if I use the exact same query here, where is this? Obviously, you won't have announcements. You see, it's complaining saying you couldn't find announcements on it because it's something we added at the mesh level, not at the backend level. So when I click this, cart ID. Oh yeah, obviously, I don't need this for the demo. All right. So when I click this, you can see that special price is always null, no matter which field, which product that you look at. This is exactly what we used to define that field in the mesh level. So if I go back, you can see that special, let me increase the size, special price actually has a value to it. And this is actually defined in the batching resolver we just saw, because we are adding resolver to the special price product. Along with this, there's another thing that I also did. I just didn't show it. So here we added a new resolver called cart resolver, and we added a new business logic to our existing backend. What it does is, if let's say I have a cart with 5 or more products, I want to set free shipping. That's a promotion that I want to do. Ideally, you would want to do this. I mean, usually if you want to do, you would maybe go to your backend and do all of this. But let's actually see how the mesh does it. And here is the example. Let me open it. Cart mutations. It's actually pretty simple. I'm defining a new field called a new mutation, and I'm just taking the cart ID, and everything for it is defined inside the cart resolver. And all these examples, again, are part of the samples. So let me show you quickly how it looks in action. So for the sake of it, let's create a brand new cart. Let's do this. Okay, it created a new cart. I'm going to take this empty cart, and let's see. I'm going to put this here. Let's see how my products are going to look like. Let me close this. We don't need extensions. So right now, you can see there are no items on my cart. Obviously, we created an empty cart. So let's actually set up. This is just the setup step. I need to set up shipping address before I can add products, and I'll set up all of them. So once I'm done here, this is done. So let's actually add more products. Add few products to the cart. Right now, I'm adding a item called this VT02. I'm just giving a quantity 3. I'm going to do this. Okay, it is done. So if I go back to my queries, if I do this, um, oops. Oh, I added to the wrong one. I need to wrong card to paste the new card that we just used. All right, this is done. So let's go back and requery the cart. And how many do we have? We have a total quantity of 3, and the shipping address is flat rate fixed. But now let me exceed that file limit. So or match or exceed, whatever. So I'm going to add another 3 products to the same cart. I'm going to click this again. It's a mutation. Okay, it's done. So if I go back to queries, if I replay the query, this time you can see my total quantity is 6, more than 5, and my shipping method is actually free instead of flat shipping. So this is a very good example of how you can use mesh without touching the source. So right now you have a query here which is touching the announcements. It's touching the announcements API. You have the products which is coming from commerce, but in the middle the special price is going to a discounting API. And then you have cart, where you have mutations that are going to a shadow cart that you have a custom cart mutations that you have created on the mesh. So with this single query, we are literally hitting 3 sources, and all with the single like if you see the extensions, this is pretty fast. I think I can just open up the HTTP details and the devcom the developer tools. You can see all of these are done within 600 milliseconds. That's very fast. So these are all the things that you can do with a mesh, and the opportunities are endless. You don't need to stop here. Like I was saying, we have these samples. Go ahead, take a look at all these samples and try out. And if you don't actually have access to App Builder today, you need to get access to it to get
Well, actually, let me jump in there. You should probably have access to it if you are a Commerce customer, because all Commerce customers, it's bundled with Commerce. So yeah, that's definitely the way to do that. So I had a couple of questions. Do you have a minute?
Sure.
Okay. So just really quickly, I mean, I'm glad that all of them didn't. I mean, it all worked pretty flawlessly, right? There was a couple of times you put some wrong things in, which was good because you could show quickly, how to get back on track.
Yeah.
In terms of troubleshooting, like, you talked about the speed at which the API mesh returns data. When you're dealing with backend services that may be not as performant as you would hoped, how do you troubleshoot? Like, is this a problem with the mesh? Is this a problem with, whatever API I'm calling? Are there tools that you can leverage to kind of help sort that out?
Great question. I unfortunately missed that. Thank you so much. So we had this VS Code folder here, right? There's a launch.json, and that's going to help you set up the debugger without doing anything. So let's actually open up the terminal. Not this. The terminal in VS Code. Right now, I'm running my mesh, but let's actually stop it and let's start it in the debug mode. So we have a debug command, mesh.json. And once I do this, it's going to start up the build and everything just like how you had earlier, but it's going to start the debugger as well automatically. And that's how you can actually look at how long it's going to taking, or what is my source actually returning before I return it back to the mesh. So you can see the debugger is started and it's listening on a WebSocket. And this launch.json that we earlier created in the init automatically, it's going to help you set up the debugger. I just need to come here to the debug panel and just click play. That's it. My debugger is attached, and I can just hover on top of them just like any ID and look at more details. But let's actually see. Let's put a debugger on a particular, let's say, a handler. A resolver, and see how it looks like. So what was the mesh we created? It's 76F. So I go to the mesh artifact, 76F. That is the mesh we just saw. I just got it from the terminal. And oh, sorry. There are tenant files here. Just go to this. This is where all your resolvers are going to reside. So maybe let's go to the announcements resolver. And maybe I want to put a debugger here. I want to see what is the announcement it's returning. Uh, and also along with it, let's say I have a batching resolver. Let's close this. And let's put a debugger here, a line here. So now this is not even my local. I'm doing this online, and it same applies in your local as well. So let me go to my uh, graphical. Let's play this, and if you see, it actually stopped here. You can look at the response. You can look at announcements. You can see them here. Announcement. This is exactly what we are going to return, and you can do whatever you want. Sorry. What did I do? You can go to the debug console and debug it further. And if you want to step in, step in. Right now, there's nothing to. So let's continue. And now that was done. That was the announcement resolver. This is the batching resolver. So it stopped here. So if I want to look at the discount, and if I want to maybe look at my route and get all the details from there, if I want to look at the context, it like all the context details that there are, and what are the params that was sent to me in the first place for the whole thing. And you can look at the request reply objects and everything. And like I was suggesting earlier, we do have secrets. It's empty right now. We didn't set up anything. So this is definitely going to help you debug further. And while integrating with your sources, it's going to be tough if you don't know how to debug. So that's why we have added all the debuggers and everything by default. So it's going to be much easier for you to look at and understand how your sources are doing. So this was the source, and I'm looking at what it returned. So that's how I'm going to do it.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, for stepping through that, if you will. So, you've helped a lot of customers, with API mesh troubleshooting and that sort of thing. Are there, issues or things that come up that are pretty common? And anything else that you want to add in terms of like troubleshooting? Broswell mentioned also expand a little bit on why we have tenant files and the mesh artifact folders to avoid that confusion, since not all meshes will create that folder.
Right. Exactly. That's right. Because not every mesh, the very first mesh we looked at, it didn't have any files on it. It was just a bland mesh. So it wouldn't have all those tenant files and all. And I didn't go into the deep because of the time and all. But if you go to the documentation and if you go to advanced features, there is local development. It's going to help you set up everything. What we just saw just now, it's going to help you with the files and all as well. And where is this? All these handlers in the GraphQL and JSON schema, you can also provide some files like response schema. You can provide it as a file. I happen to provide it as an endpoint. You can provide it as a file. So when you provide all these files, they are going to go sit in the tenants folder. And yes, actually coming to the question that you had, Ron.
Yeah.
While working with customers, the biggest questions I have been having in the late and the team is right around caching, like how you can make this better, how you can use mesh and make this more faster. The first thing you can do is put a CDN in front. If you already have CDN, like I believe most of the commerce customers do come with Fastly. I don't know exactly, but they probably do. So you can use Fastly, and there is a documentation page around like how you can set up Fastly with your mesh. So this is going to tremendously increase the performance of your mesh. And first of all, because Fastly is deployed across multiple locations, so are we. And it's going to be much faster. And as you are not going to the sources often, you only go to the sources when it's a mutation or a post call. Other than that, you can stick with Fastly and all. And along with it, few other questions we have had in the past was, how can you use these sources, and mostly around debugging, the exact question that you had.
Yeah.
And out of those questions came all the init files and everything that we're talking about, setting up debuggers by default, and improving our documentation to show how someone can use debuggers to debug it further, all their meshes.
All
Uh,
right.
yeah,
Go
these
ahead.
were
Go ahead. Yeah. I mean, we're at time, but if you have any closing comments.
uh, nothing much. I'm glad I was able to cover everything that I had, and I missed debugging. Thanks, Ron, for reminding
Yeah.
me on that.
No worries. No worries.
Yes. So happy hacking, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great session on exactly, diving into API mesh. So hopefully, folks who watch this can get in there and yeah, see what kind of magic they can create and how they can make it
For sure.
much faster.
Yeah, and we would, we really appreciate if your help as you start using APM Mesh. If you come across any example that is not part of it here, or something that you added on top of an existing example, feel free to create pull requests. We have these pull requests coming in from partners and customers as they start working with API Mesh. So feel free to do that, and we always encourage it.
That's great. Okay. So yeah, definitely. If you haven't, if you like you said, if you found something that we don't cover, let us know and create a request for us to make it better, and we will do that. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Revanth, and we'll see you next time on App Builder Live. Okay. Have a great day, everybody.